The moment I turned onto the familiar road leading to the development, the air felt heavier than I remembered. A full year away had changed more than just my perspective. It had changed the entire neighborhood. The cul-de-sac that once held a handful of modest, single-story homes now looked like the entrance to a luxury real estate brochure. Towering structures rose from lots that used to be nothing more than open patches of grass and cramped driveways. Freshly paved streets gleamed as if they had been laid only hours before. Even the welcome sign had been replaced with a gold-trimmed emblem proudly announcing the neighborhood's new identity, the Ridge at Willowstone Estates, managed by Willowstone HOA. That name did not exist a year ago. The last time I drove out of that neighborhood, everything seemed frozen in time. The association was broke, half the homes were in foreclosure, and the board couldn't even agree on whether the community pool needed a fence. I left, confident that nothing significant could possibly happen in 12 months. But as I rolled past the gates, actual gates now, everything screamed that I had underestimated the lengths to which desperate people could go when given a sliver of power and a blank canvas. But the strangest part wasn't the new buildings. It wasn't the marble fountains or the perfectly manicured flower beds that hadn't existed before. It was the uneasy sensation that all of this, the sudden wealth, the rapid expansion, had been built on something they never expected me to return for. My land. A year earlier, right before leaving the state, I had purchased 3 large adjoining parcels on the far side of the development. They were overlooked, ignored, and practically forgotten by the previous HOA. To them, it was just a stretch of empty, wooded acreage that nobody cared to maintain. To me, it was a long-term investment, something I'd come back to once life settled down. Life, however, had other plans. A family emergency pulled me away. One chaotic year later, the emergency resolved, and I returned feeling both hopeful and nervous. I expected weeds, maybe trespassers, and a few dead trees. What I found instead made my stomach tighten. The land was no longer empty. At first glance, the structures were stunning. Multi-story mansions crafted with modern architecture, massive garages, wraparound porches, and stonework that probably cost more than the original homes on the entire street. Cars sat in the driveways, sleek, expensive, clearly belonging to people who believed they lived here legitimately. Landscapers trimmed hedges that hadn't existed a year ago. Delivery vans dropped off groceries and packages as if everything was perfectly normal. They had built an entire neighborhood on my property. The realization crawled slowly across my mind at first, like a whisper I wasn't fully ready to acknowledge. But the more I observed, the more the truth sharpened. This wasn't an innocent mistake, nor was it a zoning misunderstanding or sloppy paperwork. The sheer scale of what had been done required planning, money, permits, architects, and confidence. Confidence that the rightful owner would never return. The Willowstone HOA had developed private mansions on land they did not own, and now people were living in them. With each passing minute, more details emerged. Decorative streetlights lined a road dug straight through what used to be my wooded trails. A man-made pond shimmered under the afternoon sun right where my deer blinds used to stand. Even the welcome sign had been replaced with a gold-trimmed emblem proudly announcing the neighborhood's new identity, the Ridge at Willowstone Estates, managed by Willowstone HOA. That name did not exist a year ago. The last time I drove out of that neighborhood, everything seemed frozen in time. The association was broke, half the homes were in foreclosure, and the board couldn't even agree on whether the community pool needed a fence. I left, confident that nothing significant could possibly happen in 12 months. But as I rolled past the gates, actual gates now, everything screamed that I had underestimated the lengths to which desperate people could go when given a sliver of power and a blank canvas. But the strangest part wasn't the new buildings. It wasn't the marble fountains or the perfectly manicured flower beds that hadn't existed before. It was the uneasy sensation that all of this, the sudden wealth, the rapid expansion, had been built on something they never expected me to return for. My land. A year earlier, right before leaving the state, I had purchased 3 large adjoining parcels on the far side of the development. They were overlooked, ignored, and practically forgotten by the previous HOA. To them, it was just a stretch of empty, wooded acreage that nobody cared to maintain. To me, it was a long-term investment, something I'd come back to once life settled down. Life, however, had other plans. A family emergency pulled me away. One chaotic year later, the emergency resolved, and I returned feeling both hopeful and nervous. I expected weeds, maybe trespassers, and a few dead trees. What I found instead made my stomach tighten. The land was no longer empty. At first glance, the structures were stunning. Multi-story mansions crafted with modern architecture, massive garages, wraparound porches, and stonework that probably cost more than the original homes on the entire street. Cars sat in the driveways, sleek, expensive, clearly belonging to people who believed they lived here legitimately. Landscapers trimmed hedges that hadn't existed a year ago. Delivery vans dropped off groceries and packages as if everything was perfectly normal. They had built an entire neighborhood on my property. The realization crawled slowly across my mind at first, like a whisper I wasn't fully ready to acknowledge. But the more I observed, the more the truth sharpened. This wasn't an innocent mistake, nor was it a zoning misunderstanding or sloppy paperwork. The sheer scale of what had been done required planning, money, permits, architects, and confidence. Confidence that the rightful owner would never return. The Willowstone HOA had developed private mansions on land they did not own, and now people were living in them. With each passing minute, more details emerged. Decorative streetlights lined a road dug straight through what used to be my wooded trails. A man-made pond shimmered under the afternoon sun right where my deer blinds used to stand. Even the welcome sign had been replaced with a gold-trimmed emblem proudly announcing the neighborhood's new identity, The Ridge at Willowstone Estates, managed by Willowstone HOA. That name did not exist a year ago. The last time I drove out of that neighborhood, everything seemed frozen in time. The association was broke, half the homes were in foreclosure, and the board couldn't even agree on whether the community pool needed a fence. I left, confident that nothing significant could possibly happen in 12 months. But as I rolled past the gates, actual gates now, everything screamed that I had underestimated the lengths to which desperate people could go when given a sliver of power and a blank canvas. But the strangest part wasn't the new buildings. It wasn't the marble fountains or the perfectly manicured flower beds that hadn't existed before. It was the uneasy sensation that all of this, the sudden wealth, the rapid expansion, had been built on something they never expected me to return for. My land. A year earlier, right before leaving the state, I had purchased 3 large adjoining parcels on the far side of the development. They were overlooked, ignored, and practically forgotten by the previous HOA. To them, it was just a stretch of empty, wooded acreage that nobody cared to maintain. To me, it was a long-term investment, something I'd come back to once life settled down. Life, however, had other plans. A family emergency pulled me away. One chaotic year later, the emergency resolved, and I returned feeling both hopeful and nervous. I expected weeds, maybe trespassers, and a few dead trees. What I found instead made my stomach tighten. The land was no longer empty. At first glance, the structures were stunning. Multi-story mansions crafted with modern architecture, massive garages, wraparound porches, and stonework that probably cost more than the original homes on the entire street. Cars sat in the driveways, sleek, expensive, clearly belonging to people who believed they lived here legitimately. Landscapers trimmed hedges that hadn't existed a year ago. Delivery vans dropped off groceries and packages as if everything was perfectly normal. They had built an entire neighborhood on my property. The realization crawled slowly across my mind at first, like a whisper I wasn't fully ready to acknowledge. But the more I observed, the more the truth sharpened. This wasn't an innocent—
The next morning arrived with the kind of tension that settles into the air before a storm. The newly built mansions glowed under the early sunlight, their designer facades polished and perfect, as if nothing beneath them was built on a lie. From a distance, the development looked serene. Birds crossing the sky, sprinklers drenching pristine lawns, residents stepping out for morning jogs like they lived in a magazine spread. But serenity was fragile, and beneath it lay a truth they had tried desperately to bury. I headed straight for the county records office, the one place where every land transaction, transfer, permit, and revision was documented. If the HOA had filed anything related to my property, it would be here. And if they hadn't, if they had built everything in secret, then the weight of their mistake was going to crush them. The clerk recognized the parcel numbers the moment I read them aloud. Her expression flickered from routine efficiency to hesitant curiosity, as if my inquiry wasn't the first one of its kind. She pulled the records, sliding a thick stack of documents across the counter. As I scanned the pages, a slow, unsettling pattern emerged. The titles were unchanged. No transfer of ownership, no sales, no permissions. My signature, absent on every line. But then, deeper in the stack, I found something else. A series of development applications filed by the HOA. Applications lacking the most critical element, landowner approval. Instead, a name had been listed in the owners section. Not mine, not anyone I recognized. A fictional owner. A manufactured identity. The HOA hadn't simply been cutting corners. They had forged an entire paper trail to justify building an entire luxury neighborhood. Architects, contractors, builders, every partner in the development had been presented with fraudulent documents suggesting the HOA had acquired the land through an anonymous seller. The lie was bold, reckless, and executed with the confidence of people who believed the rightful owner was never coming back. Yet the most damning evidence wasn't the forged documents. It was what wasn't there at all. No purchase records, no approval signatures, no actual deed transfers. The new mansions were built illegally from the ground up. By the time I finished reviewing the documents, the clerk's polite professionalism had shifted into stunned silence. She wasn't allowed to advise me, but the unspoken truth hung heavily between us. The HOA was in serious trouble, and they had no idea their biggest problem had just walked back into town. Armed with the paperwork, I drove straight back to the development. This time, I didn't wander or observe from a distance. I parked directly in front of the gleaming community management building, stepped out, and walked inside with the certainty of someone who had just discovered an entire board of directors sitting on a legal time bomb. Employees at the front desk paused mid-sentence, their polite greetings stumbling the moment they saw the folders in my hands. Every screen on the wall displayed images of the community, maps, homeowner directories, upcoming HOA meetings, and landscaping schedules. And in all those maps, the area containing my 3 parcels had been renamed Phase 2 Expansion. Not owned by me, not privately held, just absorbed into the HOA's fantasy of growth. I requested a meeting with the board. They weren't available, or so the receptionist claimed. her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone instructed to shield the people responsible. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the moment she asked for my name. The reaction was instant. Her hands froze above the keyboard, her posture stiffened, and her eyes darted toward the closed office door behind her. It was the kind of reaction that only comes from hearing a name they didn't expect to hear again. Word traveled quickly. Within minutes, whispers rippled through the building. The owner had returned, the one they assumed was gone, the one whose land they had cannibalized for profit. Stepping back outside, I let the quiet suburb fill the space around me. Everything they had constructed, the artificial lake, the paved roads, the ornate street signs, was built on property purchased with my own money. Not the HOA's, not the board's. Mine. The value of that land had now multiplied tenfold thanks to their illegal development. Every mansion stood as a monument to their arrogance, and every homeowner inside had unknowingly bought into the biggest scam the neighborhood had ever seen. But as explosive as the revelations were, I knew charging into battle without a strategy would only give them room to maneuver. HOA boards were infamous for twisting narratives, weaponizing bylaws, and drowning opponents in fabricated accusations. They would paint me as the villain, an intruder threatening innocent residents. They would claim ownership by community necessity, or even try to intimidate or bankrupt me with legal delay tactics. No, I needed something stronger, something undeniable. Proof. Every signature, every permit, every zoning submission, every financial trail that connected the HOA to the fraudulent project, I needed it all. Because the moment I presented the truth, the board would have nowhere left to hide. Back at home, my original home, still standing on the edge of the development, I spread the documents across the table. It looked like a crime scene, each paper a piece of evidence revealing just how far the board had gone. Construction timelines showed the homes had been built at incredible speed. Financial ledgers, those publicly available, indicated massive cash flow unaccounted for by dues alone. Someone had been funding this expansion under the radar. I traced the timeline. Everything began 8 weeks after I left. That's when the first forged application was submitted. Excavation equipment arrived shortly after, and within months, the mansions began rising. The speed was suspicious, almost too coordinated, too deliberate. And then came the most interesting discovery. The HOA had filed a temporary zoning variance for the purpose of community improvement projects, claiming they were revitalizing the neighborhood for economic stability. That variance was set to expire in just 3 weeks. 3 weeks before the county would audit the project. 3 weeks before someone in the county office would notice the missing signatures, the non-existent seller, the mismatched parcel data, the illegal transfers, and the unauthorized construction. 3 weeks before everything they built collapsed under the weight of their lies. They were running out of time, and they didn't even know it. As the sun dipped behind mansions that shouldn't exist, I felt something shift. For the first time since returning, clarity replaced disbelief. They didn't just build on my land. They built a ticking clock. And when the time ran out, the truth would explode in their faces. The storm was coming. And now, finally, I knew exactly how to bring it.
The following week unfolded like the quiet shifting of tectonic plates, slow, deliberate, and carrying the kind of tension that promised an earthquake. The residents continued their daily routines, still unaware that their pristine, gated oasis sat on land they never had the right to occupy. Children rode bikes down streets that were technically trespassing. Gardeners pruned hedges on soil they didn't own, and neighbors chatted beneath streetlights anchored into ground that belonged solely to me. Meanwhile, within the HOA building, the facade of confidence was beginning to crack. It started subtly. Cars belonging to board members began arriving earlier than usual and staying later into the evening. Meetings that once occurred openly inside the glass-walled conference room were now moved behind closed doors with blinds drawn. The receptionist, who had frozen upon hearing my name, avoided eye contact each time I walked past. And twice I caught members of the property management staff whispering in hushed tones, their faces pale with unease. They knew. Or at least, they knew enough to be afraid. But fear alone wasn't enough. I needed the board cornered, documented, and unable to rewrite the narrative. Every move had to be calculated, every step grounded in undeniable proof, because once the battle began, they would do everything in their power to protect the empire they'd illegally built. And so I began gathering everything they hoped I wouldn't. County maps, land surveys, archived meeting minutes, newsletters announcing construction milestones, emails between homeowners and the board complaining about sudden assessment increases with no explanations, even real estate listings boasting exclusive new luxury homes approved for Phase 2 expansion, properties sitting squarely on my land. Each artifact painted a clearer picture. The HOA hadn't just stumbled into illegal development, they had orchestrated it. They had weaponized bureaucracy, exploited blind trust, and manufactured legitimacy through sheer audacity. And the deeper I traced their actions, the more obvious it became that their crime extended beyond my stolen land. They had taken money, a lot of it. Assessments had skyrocketed in the past year, disguised as necessary revitalization funds. Homeowners had paid premiums for these mansions, believing the HOA owned the lots outright. Contractors had been hired under false pretenses. Even the new community amenities, the clubhouse, the fountains, the lake, were using funds siphoned through inflated fees and emergency approvals. The HOA hadn't just broken the law, they had bled the community dry. And the board's panic was growing. One late afternoon, as I stood at the edge of my property line observing the construction, a black SUV pulled up. The window lowered, revealing a woman with a tightly pinned bun and an expression that tried and failed to disguise hostility. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. The energy radiating from her told the story. She was the president of the HOA, and she had finally realized the nightmare standing in front of her. She didn't speak. Instead, she stared at the boundary stake driven firmly into the ground, a bright, unmistakable marker indicating where my property began, one she didn't expect to see, one she certainly didn't want the homeowners to notice. For a moment, her expression cracked, just slightly. Shock, fear, anger, an entire storm condensed into a fleeting flicker. Then she drove away without a word. Her silence told me everything. The board had no defense, no document, no deed, nothing to legitimize what they had built. They had gambled everything on the assumption that I was gone forever. But now that I was back, their empire stood on borrowed time. Over the next 2 days, their anxiety escalated into action. The HOA distributed a sudden community update announcing a special meeting, mandatory attendance for all homeowners. The newsletter framed it as an emergency session regarding important development news. It was vague, defensive, and dripping with the desperate undertone of a group trying to control a narrative before it slipped from their hands. But what they didn't realize was that the narrative was already gone. I spent those days finalizing my plan. The county audit for their zoning variance was approaching fast, less than 2 weeks left. And once that audit started, every discrepancy, every missing signature, every forged submission would surface. The county would halt construction, freeze accounts, and open investigations. Homeowners would demand answers. Lawsuits would multiply. The HOA board needed a solution before the audit. What they didn't realize was that I held the only solution they could possibly hope for: ownership. Because legally, every mansion, every foot of pavement, every decorative pond, every mailbox, and every street corner sat on land that belonged entirely to me. And without my signature, nothing they built could be recognized as legitimate. The entire phase of development was uninsurable, unsaleable, and unsalvageable. They couldn't buy me off. They couldn't threaten me. They couldn't remove me. The only thing they could do was negotiate, and I intended to make them crawl for it. The day before the emergency homeowner meeting, I received a letter, hand-delivered, urgent, stamped with the HOA's crest. The message inside was a thinly veiled attempt at intimidation, framed in legal jargon but pathetic in its execution. They accused me of trespassing, demanded I cease interference with community assets, and requested an immediate sit-down to discuss ownership options. Ownership options. It was almost laughable. They had taken my land, built luxury mansions on it, sold them, pocketed the money, and now wanted options. But their desperation wasn't what struck me most. It was the closing line, typed in bold as if announcing a threat. Failure to comply may result in significant legal consequences and community disruption. Community disruption. That was their fear. Not justice, not legality, not accountability. They feared the homeowners, the very people they had lured into this fraudulent fantasy, discovering the truth. And that truth was bigger than trespassing, bigger than forged documents, bigger than the illegal construction. It was the financial devastation waiting for every resident once the county audit exposed the scam. Their investments were at risk, their mortgages, their insurance, their property values, everything they had poured their savings into. And when the truth came out, they would realize one thing. The HOA hadn't just stolen my land, they had stolen their future. By the time the sun set that evening, my decision was made. Tomorrow, dozens of unsuspecting homeowners would gather in the clubhouse the HOA had illegally constructed on my property. They would hear whatever carefully crafted lie the board had prepared. And then, at the exact moment their story reached its peak, I would walk in with every document, every map, and every piece of evidence they tried to bury. The homeowners weren't ready for what they were about to learn, but the HOA board was even less prepared for what I was about to do next. The clubhouse, an oversized, stone-wrapped building with arched windows and a grand entryway, sat at the heart of the illegally constructed development. It was the HOA's pride, the crown jewel they used to showcase their new identity. Joggers passed it with admiration, children played near the decorative pond beside it, and homeowners often gathered on its shaded patio for weekend events. It projected stability, wealth, and confidence. But on the morning of the emergency HOA meeting, that polished exterior couldn't hide the tension humming beneath the surface. Cars filled the parking lot long before the scheduled start time. Homeowners stepped out in clusters, murmuring, confused, curious. Many clutched the notice that had been delivered to their doors, the one warning of urgent community developments requiring immediate discussion. The vagueness had only fueled speculation. They whispered theories of rising dues, upcoming construction projects, or changes in management. None of them suspected the truth. Inside, the atmosphere felt strained. The walls, decorated with framed maps of the expansion, suddenly seemed accusatory. The board members gathered near the front, exchanging whispers and darting nervous glances toward the entrance, as if expecting a ghost to materialize. Their stiff posture betrayed everything they tried to hide. They knew I was coming. They just didn't know when. The meeting began with forced smiles and empty pleasantries. The HOA president stood before the crowd, her composure brittle. She welcomed everyone, thanked them for attending, and launched into a speech dripping with exaggerated optimism. She spoke of growing pains, unexpected administrative challenges, and opportunities to strengthen community alignment. It was a performance rehearsed to hide disaster. But even rehearsed speeches can only last so long before reality demands its moment. When she reached the part about land classification inconsistencies, the murmurs in the room intensified. A few residents exchanged sharp looks. Some sat straighter. Others pulled out their phones as if preparing to record. The president's throat tightened with every passing second. And then the door opened. My footsteps echoed across the gleaming tile floor as every head turned. Some recognized me vaguely from old community gatherings. Others simply sensed from the board's reaction that I was the person they had been hoping would never appear. If silence had weight, it would have crushed the room. I walked toward the front, placed my folder of documents on the table, and calmly set down each item. Maps, county records, surveys, titles, deed copies, everything the homeowners had never been allowed to see. But before I could begin, the HOA president attempted to interrupt, launching into a frantic scripted speech about unauthorized participation and private association matters. Her voice trembled, her panic was obvious, and her desperation only fueled the shift happening among the homeowners seated before us. Their expressions hardened, confusion sharpened into concern, concern began to twist into suspicion. The floor was no longer hers, it belonged to the truth. When I finally spoke, my words were steady, clinical, and grounded in the thing they couldn't dispute: documentation. I laid out the timeline of development, the forged submissions, the fabricated owner signature, the absence of any deed transfers, and the illegal sale of lots that were never theirs to offer. Every fact snapped into place like the tightening of a net. The room's energy changed with every revelation. Shock spread first, then disbelief, then a growing, simmering anger that thickened the air. I detailed how the HOA had used inflated assessments to cover construction costs, how they had drained reserves under the guise of revitalization efforts, how they had misled contractors, architects, inspectors, and home buyers. Every homeowner in that room had been lied to. Many had invested their life savings. Some had moved across states believing this community was safe, stable, legitimate. And now they understood that they were living in mansions built on land they didn't legally own. The HOA president tried to defend herself, insisting that everything had been in the best interest of the community. But her voice was drowned out by the rising wave of outrage from the crowd. Homeowners demanded answers. They demanded receipts. They demanded to know how their money had been used and where it had gone. The board members, once confident and untouchable, looked defeated, overwhelmed, and cornered. Their empire, built on forged signatures and blind ambition, was collapsing beneath the weight of their own deception. But the full blow had not yet landed. The homeowners knew the board had lied, but they still didn't know what it meant for their futures. So I told them. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with the simple, brutal truth that every mansion, every yard, every fence, every driveway built on my land existed at my legal discretion. Without my approval, their property deeds were invalid, their mortgages were in jeopardy, their insurance could be revoked. They were living in homes that legally belonged to me by default, because nothing built on someone else's land can claim ownership without consent. The realization washed over the room like a cold tide: fear, confusion, betrayal. A few homeowners stood, pacing, unable to sit through the weight of what they had just heard. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Some glared daggers at the board, their anger white-hot. But before panic could take root, I delivered the part they didn't expect. I wasn't here to evict anyone. I wasn't here to destroy lives. I wasn't here to take their homes. I was here to hold the HOA accountable and to ensure the people deceived by them were protected. That's when I explained the solution the board never presented, the option they were too afraid to acknowledge. The homeowners could remain in their houses. Their investments could be preserved. Their stability could be restored. But only if the land beneath their homes was transferred into a lawful arrangement, one that recognized the truth, compensated me as the actual owner, and exposed the board's wrongdoing. The first time, the room exhaled. Confusion didn't disappear, but panic receded. The homeowners listened, really listened, because while the HOA had stolen their money, their peace, and their trust, I was giving them something the board never had, a path forward, one that would come at a cost, but a fair, legal, unavoidable one. Rent. Monthly rent for the land their homes sat on. The HOA president sank into her chair, defeated. She knew what that meant. Their empire didn't belong to them. Their authority had evaporated. Their power over the homeowners was shattered. And everything they built, every mansion, every road, every structure, would now generate income for the only rightful owner in the room. The homeowners were stunned. The board was humiliated. The room was changed forever. But the story wasn't over. The county audit was days away. Investigations were imminent, and the consequences for the board's actions were only beginning. Everything they tried to bury was rising to the surface, and soon they would pay far more than just rent.
In the days following the explosive meeting, the neighborhood entered a strange, suspended state. It was as if the entire development had taken a collective breath and held it. Homeowners walked the streets with new awareness, their eyes tracing every sidewalk, every fence, every carefully planted row of hydrangeas, each feature now marked by an invisible boundary line they had never known existed. The luxury they once took pride in had transformed into something precarious, a veneer placed atop uncertainty. The HOA board, however, didn't have the luxury of quiet reflection. If the meeting had cracked the ground beneath them, the next week shattered it entirely. Word spread quickly. News articles began to surface. Local reporters sniffed around for interviews. County officials reached out with urgent requests for documentation. The zoning variance audit, which the board had hoped to survive with carefully massaged paperwork, now carried the weight of potential criminal inquiry. The forged signatures, undisclosed development funds, and fraudulent applications were no longer internal HOA matters. They were evidence. The board's empire was collapsing, and no amount of desperate scrambling could rebuild it. As the chaos unfolded around them, the homeowners turned their attention toward the one person who hadn't lied to them, the rightful owner of the land beneath their multi-million-dollar homes. They wanted answers. They wanted security. They wanted assurance that their investments hadn't turned to dust. And I intended to give them all three. The first step was establishing a legal pathway for them, a ground lease agreement drafted through attorneys that would convert the unstable foundation of their homes into something solid and legitimate. The proposal was straightforward. Each homeowner would pay land rent directly to me, not the HOA, in exchange for long-term rights to the ground their homes occupied. A fair market rate, clearly documented, immovable by board manipulation. And the cost, principled, proportionate, and entirely the fault of the board, was far less than the personal financial ruin they would face without such an agreement. The reaction was surprisingly unified. Homeowners who just weeks earlier had been strangers became a collective force fueled by survival. They reviewed the agreements, sought legal counsel, asked questions, and made sure they understood the implications. But slowly, steadily, they signed, one by one, house by house, parcel by parcel, until the entire development, the mansions, the clubhouse, the lake, even the decorative stone paths, became a network of rented land generating income for the one person the HOA had tried to erase. The very ground beneath the community transformed from their greatest liability into my most valuable asset. And for the first time since returning home, I felt the tension of the past begin to loosen. But while the homeowners found stability, the HOA board faced consequences they could no longer outrun. Investigators uncovered financial inconsistencies spanning months, funneling of funds, inflated contractor payments, unauthorized assessments, emails discussing expediting approvals with forged signatures. The county found enough evidence to freeze the HOA's operational accounts and suspend the board from decision-making authority pending full review. The board members were questioned repeatedly. Their tone shifted from defiant to defeated, from defensive to resigned. They attempted to blame one another, the management company, former employees, anyone but themselves. But the truth was documented, time-stamped, and permanent. The empire they built on my land didn't just collapse, it backfired. They had triggered investigations. They had exposed their own fraud. They had destroyed the trust of every homeowner they claimed to serve. And ultimately, they had created the conditions that allowed me to step in as the most stable force the community had left. By the end of the month, the county issued its findings. The development was deemed illegally constructed. The HOA board was removed in its entirety. Criminal charges were recommended, and an interim manager appointed by the county took over administrative duties until the community could elect a new board. The homeowners, though shaken by the magnitude of the corruption, were relieved to finally see accountability. They no longer had to battle the people who had betrayed them. They no longer had to question the legitimacy of their own homes. The ground lease agreements shielded them from the fallout. Their property values began to stabilize, and they understood that the disaster they'd narrowly escaped would have been catastrophic had the truth remained buried. As for the HOA's leadership, the ones who had assumed I'd never return, never ask questions, never care, they faced the exact consequences they had tried to avoid. The president resigned, first, citing health reasons, though everyone knew it was fear. The treasurer followed after allegations of embezzlement surfaced. The remaining members scattered, clinging to the hope of avoiding the lawsuits that homeowners were now preparing against them. Their downfall wasn't explosive, it wasn't cinematic, it was slow, humiliating, and irreversible. And perhaps that was the most fitting ending of all, because arrogance rarely ends with a dramatic crash. It ends with quiet consequences, delivered piece by piece. As spring approached, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The clubhouse, still technically on my land, became a hub for rebuilding trust among residents. The walking trails were again busy, the lake shimmered beneath warmer skies. Even the mansions, once symbols of deception, now stood as reminders of just how much damage greed can cause when left unchecked. Every month, payments arrived right on schedule. Rent for the land, compensation for the past. A steady reminder that truth had outlasted deception, and that I had reclaimed what was always mine, not through force or revenge, but through patience, proof, and persistence. One evening I stood at the edge of the development, looking across the rows of luxury homes built on what was once nothing more than a quiet stretch of land. The view had changed, the neighborhood had changed, and so had I. I had returned after a year expecting nothing more than to pick up where I left off. Instead, I discovered mansions built on stolen land, an empire constructed on fraud, and a community caught in the crossfire. Now the same HOA that had tried to erase me was gone. The same land they stole now paid me monthly, and the same homeowners they deceived were finally safe. Not because of the HOA, not because of the county, but because I came back, and because I refused to be silent.
And that wraps up today's unbelievable saga. where one homeowner's return turned an entire HOA upside down, exposed a hidden empire built on stolen land, and proved that sometimes the biggest victories are the ones you never saw coming. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another wild HOA meltdown, property drama, or real-life revenge story. This is HOA Story Files, where the neighbors are angry, the Karens are loud, and the receipts are always shocking. See you in the next one.